code of conduct and ask that participants keep this a safe and welcome place for everyone. With that, we're happy to have Wayne Smith, Principal Cloud Architect at Microsoft, joining us today to discuss practicing responsible AI. Wayne?
Good morning, good evening. How are everyone doing? We're going to have some fun here and talk about a topic that's pretty near and dear to my heart. You should see that I've started it up already to go through the material since we have a lot to cover. This is normally an interactive experience where we do a small workshop with one group of up to 7 to 10 people. But we're going to change the profile a little bit and give you a quite overview of responsible AI workshop, and then walk through some of the principles that we would discuss in that workshop. So as I have here on the slide, when we talk about a responsible AI, we're talking about how AI is different from other technologies because of the sheer pace of change within it. As you can see here over the last 5 years, in this case, from 2016 all the way to 2019 in this case. Based on this slide, we've done a number of different components of responsible AI from a technology state, starting with vision, working our way all up to language understanding. Language understanding being the part that makes the extraction of actions and the data to act on those actions being very important to many of the technologies and ways that we can go about moving forward with different components. But in this case, we wanted to talk about how the impact of AI has been on just governments. And one of the questions here is looking at the slide here and looking at this graph, you see that 2 to 3 years in this case, the implementation of the components, we have all these different components that go on around the world, right? What's the average in this case? We're looking at 86% of issues that have happened in some way related to the implementation of AI, which is a bit disturbing, but let's move forward and see how we want to talk about that. When I talk about a responsible AI, I talk about how does it impact your brand? How does it impact the overall way that we humans move throughout society? So, start off with a couple simple questions. Who is an AI developer? Can someone give me a definition of an AI developer? Is this just one person that sits in a room, works on different components and say, oh, we'll use vision here, we'll use a chatbot here, and then we'll go ahead and change this a little bit different and continue moving on to see how do we change the world moving forward with AI, right? Is this something that's very small or is this something that's much more complex? And the reason we ask that is we're asking about how developers would change that. So we need to get in touch with who these developers are and then what they would do. So in this case, I'm using this survey from 2018 from Stack Overflow. Now, if you're not sure, Stack Overflow itself is one of the ones that is mainly where developers are. It's where we developers go in order to understand things that we're really not sure of. It's a search for code as well as different concepts, if you're not familiar with it. But as you can see on this graph, that we ask developers, these AI developers we just talked about, the ones that are changing the world, what would they do if they were asked to write some code for an unethical purpose? Now, when we say unethical, we're leaving that a little fuzzy. So we'll get to that a little bit differently. But as you can see here, about 59% said no. Depending on what it is, about 37 said yes. And then we have 5% that said yes, we will write the code. Now, the question that I always ask myself is, 5% is about 1 out of 20. Now, for those of us that drive, if we thought that 1 out of 20 people on the road would ignore stop signs, roundabouts, pedestrians and crosswalks and the rest, I don't necessarily think any of us would really want to go about driving at that point. And that's exactly my point. Even though it's a small percentage, it is something that impacts all of us as we go forward through our daily life. The next part that we really look at is really about who is ultimately responsible for this code when it gets delivered. And this will also be a callback later in this case. And in this case, we see that upper management, by and large, people believe that they are responsible for it. And then there's a pretty close split between the person that came up with the idea, i.e. the author of the components, and then finally the developer that wrote it. Whereas I pull back from this and I say we are all responsible for AI. We're all responsible for the code that goes on. But there are some legal ramifications to that we will discuss a little later in the presentation. Now we're going to get a little more interesting. Okay, do developers themselves have this obligation? Do we have the obligation to consider the ethical implications of the code that we write? Now, much like the last one, and that first one that we talked about 80% here said yes. But once again, we have a little more, in this case, about 6% that said no. These are the ones that we want to talk about. These are the ones we want to reach out to start having discussions such as this responsible AI discussion so that we can help bring them in line to understand how they're impacting the world itself. And we consider that, we want to consider the concept of a stakeholder. Now, when I say a stakeholder, there are a couple of different ways that we think about stakeholders. Stakeholders are the ones that have a material impact upon the design of a solution, but they also have the impacts all the way around. Now, due to the time that we have right now, we're not going to show the video. However, we are going to talk about the way that we consider this. And I'm going to need someone to come off mute and give me a couple ideas as we come through this, and we could put them in the chat as well. But the concept is we all believe that schools should be safe, and AI is one of the things that we can think about when we attempt to increase that amount of safety. And when we talk about that, we say, well, let's see, we have cameras in schools. Cameras are in schools in lots of places. So let's go ahead and put some AI into those cameras that are going around. And then from there, we'll be able to look for weapons and the rest. Those things make sense as you start thinking through. I don't know very many people that would say we don't want our schools to be safer. So let's use the technology we can have for that. That makes sense, right? So in the chat window, I would like for anyone to put any of the people that are stakeholders who could be impacted and affected by this kind of solution. And I'll take a look at the chat here as well. And we'll give us just a minute. Okay, great. I see someone says principals, the teachers, parents, great. Students, absolutely. Anyone else? Okay, so I will add who the other stakeholders, that group that we said with community is absolutely correct. We also need to consider who are the developers, the corporation that provided the information, the first responders that will get the information that's coming back from that system. We also have to consider who is going to be responsible for procuring all the system, the manufacturers of the cameras, the implementers and deployers of the software, the operation of software. So as hopefully that goes across, stakeholders are not as simple as the people making the final decision on whether or not to deploy it, but there are a ton of entities that are affected and impacted by our decisions to do that. All right. So now that we've kind of set the stage for the overall topic for the rest of this time, I'm going to go ahead and start switching directly into the meat of our presentation, which is right around the principles of responsible AI. Now, we have different terms that we may use when we talk about either responsible AI or the ethics of AI, because it does come back to ethics. And I will not pretend to have all the answers. Microsoft will not pretend to have all the answers. What we will do is talk about how we reach and find those answers together. And as I said, this is an overview of the workshop that we run with organizations in order to delve a little farther into this, to start asking some questions of organizations and understand how they are building AI responsibly. So as you can see here, when we talk about responsible AI, we're talking about a number of different principles. And I'm going to call it now. Number one, we have fairness, we have accountability, we have transparency, we have reliability and safety, we have inclusiveness, and we have privacy and security. So for those that saw the slide and were following along with me, you notice I jumped around on the slide a bit. And there is a reason for that, that I hope you'll join with me as we move forward with that here. So the number one we're going to talk about is really around fairness. And I start with a definition of fairness. And we talk about the state of being fair. Yes, everyone that has been a school teacher, or much like my parents, would reprimand me for using the part of the word in my definition, i.e. fair. What is the second part of this is nicer, right? Free from bias or injustice, even-handedness rather than fair, right? And the example is, in all fairness, that she would only be paid for part of the work. So when we think of fairness, these are the concepts we want to consider: being free from that bias or injustice. So one of the examples that we talk about is very simple here. Now, I am an avid Prime user, as well as a son of two educators, and I live in the suburbs with two pups who are nearby listening to the call. They may join in later. But in this case, we talk about looking at Amazon Prime. And we are in friendly co-opetition, so I don't really want to pick on them, but it makes a very poignant example, which is why I use it. So if you look at this slide, you're going to see a number of different areas, and the blue is where Amazon Prime is available. However, the gray is where they are not available for one-day Prime or Prime same-day service, based upon this area in 2016. It may have changed since then, but to be fair, but let's talk about what happened. So if we look at these areas, I'll draw attention to a few. We look at Atlanta. Looks like the south side of Atlanta, not quite as much. For the same for Dallas and Chicago for the most part as well. Right, we got the southeastern side of Washington, D.C. that's not covered by same-day shipping. And in New York City, the outer, up in the Bronx, that area. But then we look at Boston. And for those that would zoom in on this one, they will notice that there's a certain area in Roxbury in the center of Boston where there is no same-day shipping. And first you may think, well, is there a distance to depot? But no, that's in the center of the city, so it would make more sense for that to be the epicenter of having same-day service. But in this case, that is not how this works. So as they looked and did a little more investigation, they had an algorithm that was going on that route. But as we looked at it, you would feel that there are different groups that live in these areas that may be more urban than the rest, based upon either segregation, economic inequality, one or the other, which means they were not getting same-day service. And that is one of the things that you consider around fairness, right? There's a disparity in this in how that works. Was this on purpose? I doubt it. But as people look at solutions with AI, These are certainly some of the things that you'll want to consider when you use AI without really looking into the impacts that it may have on the society that's being deployed to. Now, as I run these workshops, as I said, these are much more interactive workshops, and we require you to bring not only your sense of who you are in everything that you are to understand the different ways that people are impacted by them, but there are also some areas that may be a little more sensitive, and we want to bring those front and center. So if you get slightly uncomfortable, understand that is by design, because we need to consider all of the ways that you may be uncomfortable, someone else may be uncomfortable, in order to understand the impact that AI can have on our situation as a whole. So I'm going to set the stage for this next area in this next slide before I present it. The area or impact in the stage is that a person is leaving and they are heading out to take care of a family member. They're in a rush and they move forward, but we have found a system that has been put in place that will allow people to go ahead and scan themselves in, do both facial recognition and other components of computer vision, if you will, in order to validate someone's identity. So that is the stage of this. And we have a person that is running to try and take care of their family member. Or let's pull back a little bit. Perhaps they're trying to make an important event, say a wedding, their parents' longtime anniversary, and the rest. But when they get to the airport, this is an example of the fairness that we're talking about. Unintended or intended. But this person puts their passport in, and the system responds if you zoom in at this point, and you can see that it says the photo you uploaded does not meet our criteria. The subject's eyes are closed. Now, those of us that can see understand that this person's eyes are not closed. However, because of the system and the way it was designed, that person now is unable to log in and scan into their flight to make their flight on time. That is an issue. That is unacceptable. And that is something that both impacts this person, the person next to them, as well as the brand of the company, the brand of the airline that has this deployed. These are the important things that we need to consider when we start talking about fairness. All right. So I think hopefully everyone here has an understanding of what I say when I say we need to consider fairness. Is this going to be equitable across every entity group that we can, at least us paying attention to where there may be areas and opportunities for us to reconsider, redesign our solutions. All right. The next one that I'm going to move to in this case is going to be reliability and safety. When we think reliability and safety, we really talk about how do we, quote unquote, rely upon. No, horrible definition. Let's talk about the accuracy that we're talking about for reliability. Let's talk about the honesty and the safety that we have for that, being freedom from the concerns of risk of injury, the risk of loss. These are things we consider when we talk about our safety and reliability itself. So this area, this video that I have here, that I am not going to play, but I will describe what's going on in it. We think about the area of going over a crowd, and we talk about, well, how does a crowd work? What are we doing within that crowd? Would we be safer if we could find more information about what's going on within the crowd? And this video itself has a number of people outside, and they're using a drone to go over the crowd and to look for violent behavior in order to understand who the authorities need to go to. Now, we talked about fairness before, but let's talk about the reliability and safety of the solution that's being created here. In this case, if you run this video, and I can post links to that when we send the deck as well, is really around the exaggerated emotions that it takes in this current time for us to understand that violence is about to happen. Okay, so if you think about the computer vision that's being used in this case, and understanding, do we have a bunch of people standing around, right? Are one or more of those people being violent to others of those? How do we isolate what's going on in that? How do we make those determinations? Now, if you watch the video, you would find that the only way the system was able to understand that someone was being violent to another is they had very exaggerated components that were going on. A long swing that anyone could see from a haymaker coming from about 2 miles out. Not very effective at understanding what's going on there. One of the other things that is a concern is, what's the difference between a couple of friends just horsing around and someone truly trying to hurt another? How does the computer make those determinations? That's a really hard thing for it to do once, without that context. And context is one of the components that separates us humans from machines. We can generally understand, well, this person is smiling as they go grab the other one. They have a long-standing relationship between them. And therefore, that's most likely not violence. That's just a couple people horsing around in that case, right? For the purpose of the project, they really tried to go on strangulation, punching, kicking, and stabbing, thinking that, well, we can certainly prevent violence in that case in large venues. But with that was certainly, there was a 95% accuracy, but that 5%, when we talk about reliability and safety, let's think about, much like we would think about the school video incident, what are the ramifications if the authorities are summoned with the understanding that violence is occurring? What does that do to their mindset? And how does that bring them into the situation? Is that something that's going to make things better? Is that something going to make things safer for all parties involved? Or does it have the capacity to make things much worse if they arrive looking for people that are being violent, only to understand that there were people there that were literally just horsing around? You're exactly right. In the chat window, I see they are coming in hot, and that is correct. And that is the concern that we have right there. So we want to consider that part of reliability and safety as we go through these components. Okay, the next one up is really around privacy and security. We talk about privacy and security. These are rather near and dear to our hearts, especially in our current age. In our climate right now, we have so many things that are going on where we get information from so many different sources. When we talk about privacy, let's talk with the definitions as usual, right? The state of being, quote unquote, private, having that seclusion, that solitude, concealed from view, right? Not being surveilled or disturbed in an area. In our own security, yes, being free from danger, free from care or anxiety, or something that makes us safe, a sense of protection or defense. So hopefully that helps understand our concepts there. So got a couple examples that are very small, and hopefully they help you understand the concepts as we're looking at this. So, not to pick on any company, because I, being a techno geek myself, certainly have a i7 in this case, the Roomba that goes around and helps do that wonderful chore of vacuuming my home. And then followed by vacuuming, I moved even further into the ecosystem and got the mop. Therefore, my home can get swept and mopped at any hour of the day, whether I'm home or not. And this is wonderful. Pause. Now, as you can see on this one, you can see that this Roomba is capable of looking around and mapping the house, which is great for me. I can tell it, hey, go vacuum the living room, right? I've had my nieces and nephew over. They may have spilled some goldfish. Go ahead and take care of that so I don't have to do that. However, the other side of this is understanding how it goes about that. Some of the more advanced components can have cameras in them as well. And you have to think about how this affects you in the longer term. How does this affect your privacy? Because now you have this entity, and I call it an entity because it is not fully in my control, right? That understands that, oh, Wayne is not home right now. Or Wayne has two lovely small dogs, but these are small dogs. I mean, they're small dogs with hearty attitudes, and you can't tell them they're not big dogs. But these are the pieces of information that this company has on me and my environment. That is an impact to safety and security, excuse me, privacy and security, when you consider the fact that they know when I'm home, when I'm not home, right? If someone were to compromise that device, they would have access to information I may not necessarily want them to have. And there was an incident where there was some information released, if you will, not expectedly, but it did occur where they did have some information on people's homes and the rest. So that's certainly something to consider. And then I'll go a little farther along here, and I'll need some audience participation as well. This right here, we see something. If you don't zoom in, if you just take it kind of at face value, you see a number of different tracks around here by the, let's say, bright yellow in this case on this video, on this image itself. And this is effectively a heat map. And where we have this information is stored into an application, Strava. Now, for people that are slightly more athletic or want to be athletic, want to be healthy, they may be using these to keep a map of their walks, their runs, any kind of exercise they're doing indoors, excuse me, actually in outdoors situations. So this is a heat map that occurred that was information from that data itself. And in this case, if you look a little farther in at the top side of this, you would see that there are small kind of crosses, if you will. But if you zoomed in, you find out those are airplanes. So considering that not all military bases have their locations widely known, in some cases, they are not on maps in general. However, using the data, in this case from Strava, those heat maps, they were able to determine all sorts of data and paths around this location. Now, I'll pause for a second and let you think about that from a privacy and a security standpoint. By using this device, you've given up the privacy of your location, and in this case can compromise an entire military base. That's the concern. That's not a good example of privacy itself. That's not an example of being more secure through technology. You're actually less secure. And by the way, this happened in both the Middle East and Russia when they looked on what was going on around the world, right? So they could see bases and locations that they were not supposed to know where they were. But based on this information, in this case, it made us a little less secure rather than more secure. All right. And if we do have thoughts during this discussion, please don't hesitate to post them into the chat window, and we will certainly try to get to those at the end of the presentation. But I want to make sure we get through some of this material and understand what these concerns are and how we can at least begin to address those. But if we don't know what the concerns are, we can't do anything about them. So our next one is really around inclusiveness. And when we talk about inclusiveness, we hear a lot of initiatives as of late around diversity and inclusion, but focusing in on the inclusion, we talk about understanding how we include others. Great definition, Wayne. No, not a great definition. Let's look at the second part of this definition, comprehensive, encompassing everything concerned. And in this case, we're really talking about how do we go about including or pulling in others to ensure that we are not excluding others in this case through AI. And then when we consider that overall, what does that mean for us when we design AI systems? One of the incidents that we'll talk about right now is an incident in the ACLU. Okay, there was a case that was KW versus Armstrong. And it was about them going ahead and deciding what was going to happen as we talk about cutting assistance through programs, through the Department of Health and Department of Health and Welfare. They started using algorithms to calculate where they wanted to reduce some information. There was an injunction that was created to stop this for a particular reason. And if I show this next slide, you will understand that this is the plaintiff. Okay. When you look at what's going on in this case, this particular individual who had other medical concerns, meaning in this case, the algorithm selected her for reducing the amount of money she was getting and the care that she was getting, which is a problem. Now, this was quote unquote a trade secret that they had within that organization. However, it went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and there was a class action lawsuit that was settled because they needed a different way of looking at both the data as well as the information to understand, are we excluding a group that we will be truly negatively impacting? And in this case, they were impacting the people that were most vulnerable and relied upon those medical and financial provisions in order to just live, right? We talk about AI, we want AI to help us live better lives. And excluding people is certainly not living better lives. So we talked about earlier the onus of the person that makes these decisions. Is that the developer? Is that the manager? Right? Is that the person that deployed the code? Who's responsible for this? Who is the person that wants to get up in the morning and when this individual comes to have a discussion on this, who wants to sit across a table and say, yes, we explicitly excluded you, by design? That's one of the things that is our dangers as we create AI, is we have to consider ourselves still very connected to other people and ensure that we include them rather than exclude them. Okay. When we talk about transparency, it'd have been nice if, in this case, we had more information into understanding how that was done. How was that algorithm created? How did it look at that set of information? So we talk about transparency. They talk about the transmission of light in this case, but I'm really going to look at the last part of this definition. Seen through, recognizable, or detected. What does that model mean in this case? So as part of this, I give you a little more information about myself. We talked about my family upbringing, right? Son of 2 educators. But in this case, we're going to look at something a little different. Now, I have a daughter that has severe asthma. And in this case, she's gone to the hospital a number of times as a result of that. And if we look at this set of information around pneumonia and risk from a 1995 study, they trained this from an AI perspective. And they found, in this case, that if a person has asthma, they have less risk of developing pneumonia in the hospital. Therefore, we should most likely treat them less. I'll pause for just a moment. As we consider that, anyone that has asthma knows someone with asthma that's been to the hospital, understands that is exactly the opposite. The algorithm in this case is not considering the fact that asthma patients, when they get to a hospital, the first thing they do once they recognize they have asthma is they give them specific treatments in order to try to help them breathe. Therefore, with that, that is a case of the algorithm not having the right set of information that would allow it to make the correct decision. And this is why transparency is important when we consider how we go about creating these algorithms and who has ultimately the way of looking at what's going to happen with that. Okay. And going along with that, we talk about the concept of accountability. Accountability being the obligation to report, explain, or justify that decision. It's very simple in this case. And I'm not going to pick on any particular company, not just Tesla, but other companies. It's really around autonomous vehicles. And the question really is, when something poor as far as an outcome occurs, who is accountable for this? Who is responsible for this? An overall question that we have, and as we consider technology and how it's going from an autonomous vehicle perspective, is if something bad happens in this vehicle, who is responsible? We are raising an entire generation that are used to Uber and Lyft right now for getting around, and that will continue. And once we move to autonomous vehicles, there will now be someone who has hopped into a vehicle without understanding the terms and services they agreed to on their way into that vehicle. If there is a decision that has been programmed in on whether the vehicle's occupants are to be saved or the people externally are to be saved in the case that the decision needs to be made, that is something we have to consider, and not understanding how that decision was made. One of the examples we use in the full workshop is talking about the concept of the trolley car. I'll let some of you more curious people look that up. But that trolley car problem is something that which really deals with a question of accountability, i.e., who is responsible and what decision is going to be made within a couple microseconds. So that's the concept we want to think about on that case. So those are the principles when we talk about that. When we talk about accountability in this case, I've talked about the driverless car, right? The next one is really around if a robot kills someone in this case, who is to blame, right? When we talk about moving not just vehicles, but entire lights out warehouses, electrical grids, all of these components all have that same concept. If something goes wrong with the system, who is responsible, who is accountable for that? So those are the principles, and this is really about, in this case, in this abbreviated overview, understanding what those principles are. And I did them out of order in first case because I went ahead and rearranged this a couple times. I have a horrible sense of humor, so if you did some of the other permutations, you would understand why I can't use those at mnemonics. But in this case, with the mnemonic we think about is FATRIP, to understand how the information flows through. Fairness, accountability, transparency, reliability and safety, inclusiveness, privacy and security, right? An easy way to remember those concepts as we move forward in this. Now I'm going to change gears just a bit because we've talked a bit about those principles, but really understanding why this is important is really around the governance that we have in this case, right? Understanding that while I'm giving you a bunch of information in this small presentation, it's really on you and your organization to understand what are you going to do about it. And that is a full call to action that I'm giving you right now. Understanding how you build an organization within yours that is a board or a committee, whatever you would like to call it, to have the conversations on, should we do it? If we should do it, who does it impact? And if it impacts someone, are we comfortable with the outcomes of that impact? Those are the things that these groups in every organization really need to understand and complete each and every time there is a new concept being brought forward. Because, as they say, once the genie is out of the bottle, it is really, really difficult to put them back in the water. And I don't think we necessarily have Jafar around at the end to try and trick them into taking our place in this case. So we want to be very careful at how do we go about creating these boards in this case. So before I can, tell someone to do it themselves, there's a reason that I, working for Microsoft, we have created our own committee. And we have a number of different groups that we talk about. But our stake is one of the ones that we have put information in. And more importantly, from my perspective, refuse to do certain things, changing our licensing model and the rest, because we withdrew our stake, in this case, in AnyVision, which was a company that was doing facial recognition over in the Palestine, in that area itself. And therefore, because we did not want to be associated with the company that was using that technology for that, we removed our financial stake in them. We said, you cannot use our technology for that. That is an impact, but that's really about human rights, human dignity, and the rest, not taking a decision on anything from a geopolitical area, but truly around just people. Would I want this same level of facial recognition for myself? No, I would not. If I would not want it for myself, I most likely would not want it for someone else. Therefore, I will pull back from that. And we look at this, and these are just very simple examples. Normal work resolution, we have this issue between the employee and the manager. There may be conflicts of interest. There may be ethical pieces that they have not considered. So what we talk about doing is doing this diverse committee, and it does need to be diverse in order to get the highest recommendation out of that, where the employee takes it and they send it to this committee, this council, if you will. They mull over it for a moment or a longer period of time. They make a decision that frees the manager and the employee from taking all the onus on themselves. So you see, in this case, the manager is relieved because they do not have that responsibility in themselves in this case. And when we talk about our journey, you see it's coming from 2016 all the way to 2019. We do have a committee that we call Aether. That is where we make these kinds of decisions. We understand the impacts. And as we go ahead and integrate these into our products, that is one of the ways that we continue to attempt to use our own responsible guidelines. So in the interest of time, I'm going to move forward a bit to why, right? We have both a set of AI ethics that we consider around responsible AI. And you'll see here the Universal Declaration of Human Rights put out by the UN. And I mentioned a couple of these concepts earlier on, but I will explicitly go over them now. The dignity of every individual, freedom from discrimination, freedom from invasions of privacy, freedom of expression, and then freedom of association. This certainly changes the definition as you move across the world. But as we say, you have to start with yourself and looking at what you want to do moving forward. And it is impossible, as we would say, for us, Microsoft, to empower every person and organization across the planet to achieve more without first looking at these components. When we say freedom, dignity from every individual, that is one of the cases that we have to be able to empower them. And that is the reason that we move forward this way. So to that end, we have our own human white statement, but we have our own truly Office of Responsible AI, which, as you can see, does everything from internal policy all the way to public policy. We look at the life cycle itself from AI all the way through. What are those principles? What are the people that are involved? In the center of that, you're going to see, once again, all of the components. And we have this as it evolves and visions all the way around the circle to start that life cycle again. So I'm coming to the end very, very shortly here. We talk about your responsible AI process. How do you create yours? And as I said, this is an overview of a workshop that we can set up for each of your organizations. This is a slightly different organization, but understanding who's going to sit on this board. What level are they? Because we would like people from the executives all the way down to the developers involved that have a core knowledge of that. How often is this board going to meet? How do we set up a rapid response team for when information is provided very quickly, when we need to make a decision on an engagement to pursue or to go ahead and abandon and let someone else to either reframe or move forward with that? And then how do we plan for that with other different components of the staff? And when we talked about this, we want responsible AI embedded into every decision, every project. It doesn't work out very well for us when we consider this as, oh, it's a checkbox. It is not a checkbox exercise. In this case, we have much larger amounts of impact that we will have if we let something slip through. So that's going to be the question. Now, I have a question in the chat window, which is, in the cases involving Tesla and all who do the autonomous driving cars to date, do we know who was deemed responsible? I do not know who was deemed responsible, because to me, there's always going to be a difference between, quote unquote, the legal system as well as the overall system. I'm in that case. So I'm sorry, I do not have the answer for that. But it is an area that we do need to consider as we create different technological solutions moving forward. So thanks for that question. So we talked a bit about the principles in each case, where it is the FATRIP, right? The mnemonic that you can use to remember all 6 of the principles. We talked about creating your own corporate governance, where you set up your own committee that's going to allow you to make the decisions and understand what is your brand for your organization, and how will you use that to guide what you do, what you create, and what you deploy. And then we also can have a team discussion as we move forward in those cases. So that is the end of my content, since we are running short on time very quickly. Microsoft.com/AI is where you can find a good amount of the information that I have presented, as well as links to the responsible AI components that you can take from a learning path standpoint. And then as we move forward, okay, I'm going to invite you to join us here. Adi, if you would like to rejoin and take over, and I can talk about some of the other questions that appear in the chat window as well.
Thank you, Wayne. One question that's in the chat window is, how does my organization request for a one-to-one RAI session like you've described today?
Excellent. So I have a component in my signature, and I can put that in this information as well. That since I am one of the ones, as quote unquote a responsible AI champion within Microsoft, I can certainly give you a link that allows you to book time on my calendar. Number one, for a setup where we discuss who should attend from your side of the organization. And as you've seen with the basic topics that we talk about discussion, But moving forward to understand what are the logistics, when do we want to set up? Because it is a half-day session of the information that we've covered here, in addition to a truly componentized workshop that is customized for you, where we pose different scenarios and we walk around the room to understand, hey, what are the different responses to this one at a time. So I will give a link to that along with this presentation here shortly.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Wayne.
Thank you.
And with that, please, everyone, a reminder to take a look at our full hackathon schedule. And remember to join us tomorrow to find out more about how Solution Workspace can provide your hack team with curated resources to help you get to market faster. That'll be with Brady Bumgardner tomorrow at 7 during our live session. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a happy hackathon. Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you very much. Have a great one. I will post the information here in the chat shortly.